Thanks everyone for joining us for Eagle Dream's second 20-minute tech break. Hope everyone had a great week and happy Friday. So if you have not joined us for last week's tech break, really the whole premise of why we're doing this is to encourage our friends, family, colleagues to take 20 minutes, be selfish, learn something new, and have an open conversation with us around different technology topics. So this week, we're going to focus around cost optimization, and excited to be joined by Justin Guse and Dustin Potter from our Eagle Dream team. Justin is a senior cloud solutions architect, and he's also an AWS Partner Network Ambassador. And Dustin is a senior cloud solutions architect from our Eagle Dream side as well. So wanted to give you guys a chance to learn more about cost optimization. First 10 minutes, we're going to go through some questions, and then the last 10, we're going to open it up to Q&A. So if you have any questions throughout the session, feel free to throw them in the chat box in the lower right-hand corner. Also, at the end, we'll give you a chance to ask your own question. So you can raise your hand, we'll call on you, you can unmute, and we can go through those questions. All right, Dustin, I think I'm going to hand it off to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Courtney. Yeah, certainly, not as glamorous as the serverless 20-minute tech break, but, cost is something that's on all of our minds all the time, especially as we move into the cloud and figure out how can we optimize for cost and adopt some of the models that we used to have in the data center to try to prioritize some of this stuff. So, today, we're going to be talking about these main 4 questions, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. There, even with these 4 questions, there's a ton of things that we could talk about. We're going to try to, keep it condensed to try to save some of the time here. So we'll, try to keep these answers as succinct as possible. So our first one here is, what are some of the most common areas for cost optimization? And, I think that, head on, the one that's on everybody's mind is really, how can I do resource right sizing? We'll talk more about this in the third question, but, how can I make sure that I'm not overspending? How do I make sure that I have the overhead that I need to be able to take on whatever are the needs for my workload, whether that's, incoming requests or it's an ETL process and making sure that it's got enough memory allocated to it. And a lot of these come down to monitoring, knowing the resource types. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about it. I think that another area in that is very important when we consider cost is the platform that we're running on. Certain platforms in AWS cost more to run than others. For example, Red Hat or Windows, there's subscriptions that are involved. So you end up paying for overhead on that front as well. Justin, what do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit or easy ways that people can cost optimize. And it really depends on the type of workloads that they're running. But, right off the top, some easy ones, for example, are S3 storage. So if you're using a lot of S3 storage, there's some easy ways to save on, a lot of the data that you're storing that's not being frequently used. So there's different storage tiers. There's regular S3 standard, but then if you're not accessing that data frequently, things like infrequent access. If you've got more archival data workloads or things that you're not accessing frequently, just for backups, for example, you can use things like Glacier Deep Archive, which are really, really cheap tiers of storage. So you can store a lot of data at a really low cost. And then, other ways to do it too would be like, if you're running Ec2 instances, a lot of compute, attaching cheaper disks to your instances. So if you're just, backing up, using things like SC1 disks or, ST1 disks, depending on the type of workload.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that a lot of people, when they've got certain instances in their environment that are costing them a lot of money, they tend to be instances that are tied to EBS volumes that are massive. And while EBS is relatively cheap, it's still not the best in terms of long-term storage. So, we really do encourage people to look at how, why they're storing that data over a long enough period of time, and is there a way that they can offload some of that storage to S3 and bring it back onto the disk when they actually need it. And that's, we've been doing a lot of stuff with the data lake area recently, and that's one of the main proponents of that, is that you decouple storage and compute so that you can really get the best of both worlds. So even if you have to run something all the time, you don't necessarily need to be paying for all that storage all the time as well. So what about the next question, Justin?
Yeah, so I can dive into that a little bit. So reserved instances and savings plans. So what's the difference? Which one should you use? So I would say right off the bat, there's some similarities between the two. So first of all, they're both ways to save on monthly AWS compute costs and usage costs. They can be purchased in 1 or 3 year terms. They both offer flexible payment options, so you can do different types of payments like all up front and get the most bang for your buck and most savings, or do something like a partial upfront payment or no upfront payment. And then, another similarity between the two is they really actually both offer the same amount of savings over running your workloads on demand. But that's kind of where the differences drop off. And when we start to look at RIs versus savings plans, I'd say one of the top differences between them is that, RIs were the original cost savings method to save over on demand. And that was really, that cost savings was in exchange for committed utilization, whereas savings plans, you're committing in exchange, for a committed hourly spend. So how they distribute that and price that out is a little bit different. Another difference between the two is that reserved instances are primarily used for EC2 and RDS, a couple other services like Dynamo and Redshift, but savings plans are focused just on EC2. So if you're just doing EC2 savings plans, or if you're doing just general compute, that applies to EC2, Lambda, and Fargate. I'd say then the third item there would probably be, the biggest difference would be that RIs are much more bound to a region or an instance type or a platform. So you don't get that flexibility if you ever want to shift your savings, your savings around. Whereas savings plans, you're not necessarily bound to a particular instance type or region or platform. So they're way more flexible. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Dustin.
Yeah, I think the point about savings plans being applicable to serverless like Lambda and Fargate is a huge advantage. If you are running containers and you are running Fargate, already you're probably seeing a lot of good savings benefits, but the ability for savings plans to reduce your cost on Fargate pricing is huge. So people that are already in that boat have been able to make great strides in improving their savings. On top of that, I think it's important to note that, whereas with like convertible RIs, you can sell on the marketplace. Savings plans offer that advantage that it doesn't really matter if you switch instance types or families, it's still applicable to that. But say you're in the case where you just simply don't need that compute anymore. Convertible RIs do offer an advantage in that, because you can try to sell that and regain some of that pricing or some of that expenditure that you already went through.
Yeah, and if you're trying to determine which one to use today, so savings plans are the newest version of cost savings for compute. You can still purchase RIs. There's no issue with doing that. Some companies might prefer that, but AWS recommends going with savings plans if at all possible.
Cool. So the third one here, what are some tips for resource right sizing? I think that despite everybody's, want to move towards a serverless environment, the fact of the matter is a lot of us aren't there yet. So we are dealing with EC2 instances and like RDS instances, Redshift instances that we do need to figure out how to right size. So, I'd say the biggest help with that is first knowing what your options are, knowing what the families are, what the instance types are, what the variations of them are, and knowing how your workload is bound. So if you need to be using a resource type that is more memory heavy, more compute heavy, something that you can optimize for your workload. And then there's always something to be said about really leveraging horizontal scaling. So the advantage of being in the cloud is that we can do this really easily. So if we can minimize how small our instances are, even if we know that we're going to need multiple to accommodate the demand on our system, we can scale to accommodate that over time so that we're not always paying for that for that uptime 24/7. So looking, and that's not always the easiest thing. I get that. I've had to deal with a lot of workloads that are constrained in some way, and it makes it very, very difficult to do that type of horizontal scaling. But I can also say with certainty that it's almost always possible. So, finding a way to leverage, whether it's auto scaling or some other method, to be able to horizontal scale and right size your instances to an even smaller size is hugely beneficial.
Yeah, and even if you can't horizontally scale, it's not the end of the world. There's still options out there. And actually, AWS provides a tool called the Ec2 Compute Optimizer, and it's free to use. You can opt in. So if you've got a lot of EC2 instances running, it'll give you suggestions on potentially right sizing. So if you're underutilized or overutilized, great way to do that. Or you can use things like CloudWatch metrics and do some intelligent alerting. So if you're exceeding CPU or something all the time, you can alert on that and then act and then change your instance types. Then there's some other third-party tools out there too that we'll talk about in the next question that you can also use for right sizing.
Yeah, which I think, we might as well just jump into that. That leads in perfectly to the fourth point.
Yeah. So the question is, what are some ways to monitor and manage costs in AWS? Well, luckily, AWS provides a variety of tools to do that. In addition to that, there's a lot of third-party options. Many different ways to track costs. So first and foremost, I think it's important that in order to get accurate cost reporting, so you can visualize and understand, where your costs really are, is important to tag your resources. So tagging is probably one of the most important things you could do to break things up, visualize different ways by application, by department. And that's really what these tools are built off of is that tagging. So having that in place is important. But out of the gate, AWS has what's called AWS Cost Explorer. And it is an AWS native tool, allows you to visualize a report on your usage and spend across all of your accounts, especially if you got multiple accounts across an organization. And you can review cost by service, cost by account. You can review your RI usage and your savings plan usage. So really great tool. And then there's another tool called AWS Budgets. So it's a way for you to kind of set budgets for every month to, so you can really base your spend upon, what you're willing to spend and have it do things like alert when you start to get close to that budget. So if you get close to 80% that month, it'll alert you, and then you can act and make sure that, you're not going to be overspending. And then other tools like AWS cost and usage reports, a good way if you're going to use some cloud native tools to analyze your cost data. What do you think, Dustin? What about some of the third-party tools maybe?
Yeah. So there's also the third-party tools, things like Cloud Health, Cloud Checker, which I kind of like to think as like these AWS internal tools on steroids. They can, in combination with the ability to split different workloads up across accounts, as well as, a good tagging strategy, you can use that to monitor the health at very granular levels and split your workload and how you're actually monitoring that cost across different verticals. And that's really advantageous. On top of that, if you have on-prem workloads in combination with your AWS workloads, they can actually handle that too. And that's hugely beneficial.
Yeah, we love the cloud native tools, but sometimes those third-party tools are really helpful, especially if you're monitoring a lot of accounts throughout your company. It's a great way to kind of aggregate everything in one place and have everything at your disposal. So, we're all about those too.
Yeah. I just want to reiterate the fact that, Budgets has that monitoring that alerting capability. And I think that being extremely proactive like that, whether or not you're even monitoring and saying, okay, alert me when I get to 50%, and all of a sudden you get that 50%, 5 days into your billing month. Well, that's a huge red flag. So being proactive about that instead of just reviewing your statement, your bill at the end of the month is going to save you a lot of money. So those are our 4 main questions that we wanted to answer as far as today's tech talk. Why don't we go into, let me see, make sure I got the focus on the right thing here. A little bit of Q&A. So, if you just use the chat tool in Ring Central here, It'll allow you to kind of raise your hand. You can type what you want to ask in the chat box, and we'll field some questions.
Dustin and Justin, we do have one question in the chat box from Gary. I can repeat it for those on the phone. My costs are largely driven by HPC-like compute, spinning up a number of GPU EC2 clusters with multiple hour wall clock compute time on individual jobs. What is your experience with EC2 spot fleets, spot blocks?
Yeah, Spot is an amazing resource as long as you don't necessarily have a timeline that you're trying to hit, or at least if you're trying to do it in the most cost-effective manner. I mean, obviously, if I'm bidding for compute at a certain rate and it's, it never gets to that rate, then I'm never going to get any compute time. But as long as I have that limit set high enough, then you are pretty much guaranteed to get some compute time in there. So I think that it is a good way to reduce your costs. I think that something like that, I might do a blend of on-demand or reserved instance pricing, and then leverage Spot to garner a little bit of extra where I can. I don't know, Justin, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand too, for those that aren't really familiar, what Spot is. Spot's a good way to use really cheap compute for really stateless workloads that can tolerate going up and down. They use the excess compute that AWS has, and they offer that to you at a really low price. So again, I think workloads like that are fairly well suited to Spot, but it is one of those things that you do have to keep an eye on, and it takes some understanding of how it works to make sure that you don't interrupt your workload.
All right, I got another question in the chat box from Jessica. Do you have any real client examples or any maybe real world recent examples of customers that are looking to optimize their costs? I think that's a great question, especially with recent events right now. I think a lot of people are looking to kind of optimize and save and reduce those costs. Do you have any examples you could share of things that they're doing now that have been beneficial?
Yeah, I've got one. So right now we're working on a project for a company where they're going to be running a very large remote desktop session host farm. And because they're going to have so many of those running throughout the day, they wanted to be able to save costs at night because they're a medical practice, so they're not open at night. They're dentist's office. So one way that we're kind of helping them out to save significantly on costs is to shut those fleets down at night. So we're probably going to be using a tool called the Ec2 Instance Scheduler. It's a free solution that AWS offers that anybody can use. It allows you to schedule the shutdown of instances, and then we're going to be doing some intelligent scripting around it to be able to dynamically turn them off and turn them on during the day. And because they're Windows instances, they tend to be a little bit pricey. But that's one example of we'll be saving them thousands of dollars a year just by shutting instances off at night.
Yeah, and I actually have another one that's we don't talk a lot about this in cost optimization, but it is important to know. We had a client recently that had the problem where, to handle the demand on the system during load testing, when they were simulating it, they were spinning at excess of 70 servers for their web service fleet to do that. And it was great because yes, you're using horizontal scaling, but at the same time, you're spinning up a whole lot of servers to handle your everyday workload. So we went in there with a newer tool that they've released called Code Guru Profiler to look at what their application was doing so that we could optimize it a little bit and find out where those bottlenecks were. And by doing that, we found a couple really key issues that didn't take a whole lot of effort to remediate. And that ended up taking so much load off their system that now when they need to, horizontally scan or scale, it's more like 5 to 10 servers instead of 70. So there's a lot of different ways you can go about doing this. not just in terms of looking at what kind of instance type and decommissioning resources at the end of the night.
Great. I have a question from Scott, and then I would love to open it up to some folks that just joined us on the phone. So once we get through this question, I'll open it up. From Scott, time is the hardest thing to get more of. Which cost containment strategies tend to take a long time versus which ones can be done quickly?
That's a good one.
I can think of one, right off the bat. That's a great question too, because, we are talking about a lot of different ways to cost optimize, but sometimes it's easier said than done. But one thing I can think of right off the bat is if you're running a lot of different workloads in AWS, and you've got some other environments like QA environments or dev environments that don't need to be running all the time. Granted, they can be shut off if they're running on EC2 instances or even RDS instances, but just again, shutting those off when not in use, and doing some intelligent automation around that is one really quick way to save costs. And then, we talked a little bit about savings plans. There's really no upfront capital investment that you need to get started with savings plans. You can opt in to do a no upfront payment. So if you know that you're going to have steady state compute usage over time, which most customers do, it's a really easy way to start saving immediately, because as soon as you buy that savings plan, you start to benefit right after purchase. So those are a couple of quick ways that I could think that you can save fast.
Yeah, and savings plans, reserved instances, those are huge, like instant. So that's awesome. Another really quick point that I want to add though is that don't forget the time and the money spent for operational overhead. So whenever you can, try to leverage managed services. So if it's using something like RDS instead of running your own database, you're going to get a huge cost benefit from that just because you don't have that operational overhead. And also things like serverless, those are, I would kind of put that in the same bucket as managed services because now you are not managing servers. It's always a win-win.
Awesome. For folks on the phone, do you have any questions? Feel free to unmute and ask if you have anything. Last call for anybody else.
Don't be shy.
I think this was great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dustin and Justin, for taking the time and for everyone else for joining us. This is a great session around cost optimization. Next week, we're going to be back here, same time, same place, 12:30 on April 10th. And the topic is going to be around data lakes. So we'll be joined by Brianna and Maria on our team. They are awesome with what they do with our data lake and data analytics. So looking forward to seeing you then. Thanks, everyone.